They had never been apart for more than a single night in 20 years. Not by accident, not by the specific coincidence of two brothers who happened to like each other's company, by the specific deliberate arrangement of two people who had been born 4 minutes apart and who had spent the following 20 years treating the 4 minutes as a specific only separation they intended to allow. They shared a room until they were 18. They shared friends. They had, by their own account and by the account of everyone who knew them in the small Iowa town where they grew up, something closer to a single extended consciousness occupying two bodies than two separate people who happened to look alike. His name was Walter. His brother's name was Wendell. They were identical twins, born in 1922, and when the draft board in their county processed their registration in 1942, the clerk made a joke about needing only one form because no one would be able to tell which twin had filled it out. The joke was not entirely a joke. Their own mother sometimes paused for half a second before saying which one she was speaking to. They enlisted together. They requested the same unit, the Army, in one of the specific small mercies that the specific wartime bureaucracy occasionally produced, granted the request. The twin brothers from Iowa went through training together, shipped to the Pacific together, and served in the same infantry company together for 18 months. Walter came home. Wendell did not. Before I tell you what happened on the island where they served and what it did to the brother who survived, I want to ask you directly, subscribe and share this episode. The specific experience of the surviving twin. The particular form of survivor's guilt that occurs when the person who died was not simply a friend or a brother in an ordinary sense, but the other half of what felt like a single shared identity, is one of the most severe and least discussed forms of grief that the war produced. Subscribe and hit the like button. Back to Walter. Back to the brother who came home alone. The specific psychology of identical twins. The particular intimacy that develops between two people who share not only an upbringing but a genetic identity so complete that the outside world frequently cannot distinguish them, is a specific field of study that has produced findings directly relevant to understanding what happened to Walter, and it is worth examining before returning to his specific story. Researchers who study twin identity have long noted that identical twins, particularly those raised in close proximity the way Walter and Wendell were, often develop what the literature calls a merged or co-constructed identity, a psychological self-concept that is genuinely built around the pair rather than around the individual. This is different from a close friendship or even a close sibling relationship between non-twins. The specific mechanism appears to begin in infancy, when the twins are mirror images of each other in ways that shape their earliest experience of self-recognition, and it deepens through childhood when the twins are treated by family and community alike as a single social unit rather than two separate ones. For most twins, this merged identity gradually differentiates over adolescence and early adulthood as the twins develop separate friend groups, separate interests, separate romantic relationships, and the specific psychological work of individuation proceeds the way it does for any sibling pair, simply starting from a more fused baseline. Walter and Wendell's case was notable to the researchers who later studied it because the differentiation never happened. They chose, repeatedly and consciously, to resist the specific pressure towards separate identity that most twins eventually yield to. They wanted the same friends. They dated. On the rare occasions they dated at all, in a kind of informal pairing where one's interest in a girl was treated by both of them as relevant information for the other. They enlisted together specifically to avoid the separation that the draft might otherwise have imposed. This matters because it means that when Wendell died, Walter did not lose a brother in the way most surviving siblings lose a brother. He lost a half of a psychological structure that had never been allowed to fully individuate. The specific term that twin loss researchers now use for this is twinless twin syndrome, and the specific literature describes its central feature in language that echoes, almost exactly, the language Walter used in his own 1994 interview. Survivors frequently report not feeling like a survivor of someone else's death, but feeling instead like an incomplete person, as though a physical part of themselves had been amputated rather than a loved one lost. Walter did not know this term. It did not exist in its current clinical form until decades after Wendell's death. The foundational research on twinless twin syndrome was conducted primarily in the 1980s and 1990s, by which point Walter had already spent 40 years independently arriving at the word amputation entirely on his own, simply because it was the only word his own experience offered him as accurate. When the 1994 interviewer mentioned gently that there was now a clinical term for what he was describing, Walter reportedly went quiet for a long moment and then said, "I wish someone had told me that in 1945. I spent a long time thinking I was the only person who had ever felt this exact thing, and that the feeling itself was some kind of moral failure, vanity, maybe. Thinking my grief was special. It would have helped some to know it had a name." This detail matters enormously for understanding the broader population of surviving twins that the Second World War produced, a population whose size is difficult to establish precisely, but which numbered, by conservative estimate, in the low thousands among American servicemen alone, given that twins enlisted and were occasionally permitted to serve together at rates that put meaningful numbers of identical twin pairs into the same combat units across every theater of the war. Most of these surviving twins, like Walter, had no clinical language for what they were experiencing, and no community of similarly situated people to compare notes with. They processed one of the most psychologically distinctive forms of grief that the war produced entirely in isolation, using whatever private vocabulary they could construct for themselves, the way Walter constructed the word amputation. There was another surviving twin whose story illuminates a different facet of this experience. A man from Minnesota named Carl, whose twin brother Carl had been killed in the European theater in early 1945, only months before the war's end. Carl's case differed from Walter's in one critical respect. Carl and Carl had not served in the same unit. Carl had died on a different continent, in a battle Carl learned about only through a telegram delivered to their shared family home, and Carl spent the rest of his life carrying a different variant of the same fundamental wound. Not the guilt of physical proximity, of having been 11 feet away and unable to help, but the guilt of distance, of having been entirely elsewhere, safe, eating breakfast in a mess hall in Italy at the exact hour his brother was dying in Germany without him. Carl described this in a 1989 interview conducted by a regional historical society as in some ways a harder grief to carry than Walter's, precisely because it offered no scene to revisit, no 11 feet to measure and remeasure. There was only the telegram and the unbearable mathematics of trying to calculate, from the time zones and the dates, exactly what he had been doing at the moment his other half had ceased to exist. He performed this calculation, he admitted, hundreds of times over the decades, refining it as he learned more details of the battle from post-war histories, always arriving at some version of the same unbearable answer. He had been sleeping. He had been sleeping peacefully on the other side of the world while his twin brother died. Carl never married. He lived with his parents until their deaths, and then alone until his own in 1991, in the same house. His family told the Historical Society interviewer that Carl had kept Carl's bedroom entirely unchanged for 46 years, the same bedspread, the same boy belongings on the same shelves. Not as a shrine exactly, his niece insisted, but simply because Carl had never been able to bring himself to make the decision to change it, and eventually the not deciding became its own kind of permanent decision, and the room simply stayed. Walter and Carl never met, as far as the historical record shows, but their stories together sketch the outline of an entire category of grief that the Second World War produced, and that the culture surrounding these men had almost no resources to address. They were given the same general advice that all grieving veterans received. Time heals. He wouldn't want you to suffer. You have to move forward for your family. Advice that was not wrong, exactly, but that was calibrated for an ordinary loss, a loss of someone other than the self. And neither Walter nor Carl ever fully experienced their grief as a loss of someone other than the self. They experienced it as a loss of part of the self. And no amount of well-intentioned counsel aimed at the first kind of grief ever quite reached the second kind. This is, I think, the central insight that Walter's story offers anyone listening who has never been a twin and cannot fully intuit what that particular bond feels like from the inside. That some forms of human attachment are simply different in kind, not merely in degree, from the attachments most of us form, and that the grief produced when those attachments are severed by violence requires a vocabulary and a patience that the people around the griever may not know how to offer, because they have never needed that vocabulary themselves. Walter eventually built his own vocabulary, alone, across 50 years, arriving independently at words the clinical literature would not formalize until he was already an old man. Carl built a frozen bedroom instead of words, and never quite managed the words at all. Both of them carried their brothers for the rest of their lives, in the only ways available to them, and both of their stories deserve to be told with the specific care that this particular form of loss requires and so rarely receives. They were on a Pacific island in 1944. The specific campaign does not need naming for the specific story to be told, and Walter, in the 70 years he lived after, was always careful in interviews to keep the specific geographic and tactical details general, because he said the details were not the point, and he did not want to point loss in the specific military history that surrounded it. What matters is this: their company was advancing across open ground under fire, and Wendell was hit, and Walter was 11 feet away. 11 feet. He measured the distance many times in his mind over the following decades, paced it out literally in his backyard in Iowa more than once in the years after the war, try to understand what 11 feet meant, and whether 11 feet was a distance that should have meant he could have done something and didn't, or the distance that meant there was nothing he could have done at all. He reached his brother within seconds. Wendell was still alive. He was alive for perhaps 4 minutes. The same 4 minutes, Walter would note in the memoir he eventually wrote, that had separated their births. Walter held him. He said the things you say. Wendell, by Walter's account, was not afraid. He said something to Walter in the last minute that Walter never repeated to anyone. Not his wife, not his children, not the interviewer who spent 30 hours with him in 1994 compiling an oral history. He said it was Wendell's, and Wendell's alone, and he was going to keep it that way. Wendell died in Walter's arms on the Pacific island. Walter's company continued the advance 20 minutes later, because the war did not pause for the specific death of one soldier. However, that soldier had arrived in the world. Walter served 11 more months. He was, by every account other than his own, a competent and even exceptional soldier in those 11 months. Decorated, in fact, for an action 3 months after Wendell's death, though Walter rarely mentioned the decoration and never displayed it. He came home in 1945 to Iowa, to parents who had buried one son in the Pacific cemetery system and were now receiving the other son standing on the porch. And the moment of that homecoming was, by every account, one of the most difficult moments in the family's history. Harder, his mother said later, than the day the telegram arrived, because the telegram had been grief without complication, and Walter standing on the porch was grief with the unbearable addition of relief, and the two feelings would not sit quietly together. Walter knew this. He saw his mother's face do the thing it did. The specific flash of joy at seeing him alive, immediately followed by the specific flash of something like guilt at having felt joy, immediately followed by the grief for Wendell arriving in full. He watched this entire sequence happen on his mother's face in under 2 seconds, and he understood, he said later, that he was going to spend the rest of his life being the son who reminded everyone of the son who was gone, simply by existing, simply by walking into a room. He married in 1948. His wife, Dorothy, knew about Wendell from the first conversation they ever had. Walter made sure of this, told her early and told her plainly, because he said he did not think it was fair to let anyone get close to him without understanding that they were getting close to half of something, that the other half was buried in the Pacific, and that he did not know, even at 26, whether the half that remained was capable of being whole on its own. Dorothy married him anyway. She told an interviewer many years later that she had never for one day regretted it, and also that she had never for one day stopped being aware that some part of her husband was permanently occupied with a 4-minute conversation on a Pacific island that she would never be allowed to know the contents of. This is the specific shape that Walter's survivor's guilt took, and it is worth being precise about the shape, because a popular understanding of survivor's guilt, the simple feeling of why am and not me, does not fully capture what Walter carried. Walter's guilt was not primarily about the 11 feet, though the 11 feet were part of it. It was about something more structural. He had been born as one half of a pair, had lived 20 years as one half of a pair, and had then continued to exist for the next 70 years as a half. He did not feel like a survivor in the ordinary sense of someone who escaped a danger that killed someone else. He felt like an amputation that had, against all biological logic, continued walking around. He used that word, amputation, in the 1994 oral history, and the interviewer, who had conducted dozens of these interviews with combat veterans, said afterward that it was the most precise and devastating description of surviving twin grief she had ever recorded. Walter said, "People think I lost a brother. I did not lose a brother. I lost the other half of whatever I was What's left over after that isn't really designed to function as a whole thing. I have spent 50 years learning to function as a whole thing anyway, badly, because the alternative was worse for the people who loved me. He raised 3 children. He ran a feed store in the same Iowa county where he and Wendell had grown up. He was by every external measure a successful and respected man, active in his church, active in a Lions Club, the kind of small-town fixture whose funeral, when it eventually came in 2009, drew nearly the entire county. None of the people at that funeral, his daughter said afterward, fully understood what they were burying, because Walter had spent 65 years presenting a version of himself that was complete enough to fool almost everyone except the people closest to him. His children grew up knowing they had an uncle who died in the war. They did not grow up knowing the specific weight their father carried about it until they were adults themselves, when Walter began, slowly, in his 60s and 70s, to let pieces of it become visible. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic confession the way these stories are sometimes told, but in fragments over years, the way a man releases something he has held so long that releasing it all at once might do more damage than the holding did. The specific grief of Walter and Wendell's parents deserves its own attention, because their experience illuminates a dimension of the story that the focus on Walter's individual suffering can obscure. They did not simply lose one son and welcome home another. They spent the remaining decades of their lives raising, in effect, half a pair of twins, and learning to do something that nothing in their previous experience as parents had prepared them for. Walter's mother, in particular, struggled for years with a guilt of her own that mirrored her son's in an uncomfortable, parallel way. She had, without ever fully articulating it even to herself, spent 20 years thinking of her sons primarily as a unit, the boys, in the family's shorthand, almost never Walter and Wendell separately except when a specific occasion required distinguishing them. When the telegram arrived announcing Wendell's death, she described a family friend decades later, the strange and shaming sensation of not immediately knowing how to grieve one of the boys without instinctively reaching for the other, as though her mind itself had not been built to process the loss of half a unit it had never learned to see as two. She lived for 30 more years after Wendell's death, well into Walter's middle age, and family members who knew her in that period describe a woman who never stopped, in small unconscious ways, reaching for Wendell. She would set 2 cups of coffee on the table some mornings before catching herself. She referred to Walter on occasion by the wrong name, not out of confusion about who was standing in front of her, but because some old groove pathway in her mind still defaulted to the pair. Walter never corrected her. He told his daughter once that being called Wendell by his mother was the only time in his adult life he ever felt, briefly and painfully, like his brother was still in the room. Walter's father took a different path through the same grief, the path more commonly described in this era and in this region. He simply did not speak of Wendell again, not because he had stopped feeling the loss, but because the culture of rural Iowa in the 1940s offered men of his generation almost no permission to grieve aloud, and he had absorbed that lesson completely. He attended Wendell's eventual reburial. The family elected, as many did, to have Wendell's remains returned from the Pacific Theater cemetery system in 1948 and reinterred in the family plot in Iowa. And Walter's sister recalled that their father stood through the entire graveside service without visible expression, and then went home and worked in the barn alone until well past dark, and never mentioned the day again. This reburial in 1948 is itself a detail worth dwelling on, because it gave Walter something that many surviving family members of the war dead never received, a grave he could visit without crossing an ocean. Walter went to that grave every year on the anniversary, for 61 years, in addition to the fishing trip on their joint birthday. His children grew up understanding that there were 2 fixed points on the family calendar that belonged to their father alone, that no one accompanied him to, and that no one asked him about when he returned. The headstone reads simply, Wendell Arthur, and then the dates 1922 to 1944. Walter chose the inscription himself, and family members say he agonized over for weeks, drafting and rejecting language that felt too sentimental, too military, too final. What he settled on, beneath the name and dates, is a single line that his daughter said took her years to fully understand: the better half. She assumed for most of her childhood that this was simply an affectionate, slightly old-fashioned turn of phrase. She came to understand, only after her father's own death, reading through the letters he had written to Wendell across 7 decades, that he had meant it with complete and devastating literalness. Walter did not believe he had been the better of the two. He believed, and apparently never stopped believing despite a lifetime of people insisting otherwise, that Wendell had been. This belief, that the wrong twin had survived, is one of the most painful and most common features of twinless twin grief that researchers have documented, and it appeared in Walter's case with specific, particular cruelty. He had genuinely, by every account other than his own, lived an exceptional life. He had been a good husband, a good father, a respected member of his community, a man whose funeral drew nearly an entire county. And he had spent every day of that exceptional life privately convinced that he was living in the place of someone who would have done it better, who would have made a finer husband, a wiser father, a more deserving recipient of the long life that fate had, in Walter's private accounting, misallocated. There is no resolving his belief with facts, because it was never built from facts in the first place. Wendell died at 22, before any of the tests of adult character that Walter spent 70 years passing or failing had the chance to be administered to him. There is no way to know whether Wendell would have been the better husband, the wiser father. There is, in the most basic sense, no Wendell left to compare Walter against, only the perfected, unchanging 22-year-old that grief had preserved in amber, who could never disappoint anyone, never fail at anything, never grow old and ordinary and flawed the way Walter was required to do for the next 65 years. This is perhaps the cruelest mechanism in this entire story, that the dead twin, frozen forever at the moment of his death, became in Walter's mind an impossible standard that no living person, least of all the brother who had to keep living, keep aging, keep making the small daily compromises and failures that living people make, could ever measure up to. Walter was not competing against the real Wendell. He was competing for 70 years against a flawless ghost his own grief had constructed, and he could never win, because the contest had been rigged by loss itself before it ever began. His daughter said that understanding this, finally in her 40s, reading her father's letters after his death, was the single most clarifying and most heartbreaking realization of her adult life. She had spent years frustrated with her father's quiet, persistent self-diminishment, his refusal to accept the praise and gratitude that everyone around him offered freely. She finally understood, too late to tell him she understood, that he had not been fishing for reassurance or performing humility. He had been reporting, as accurately as he knew how, on a contest he had been losing in his own mind since he was 22 years old, against an opponent who could never lose because he had never been required to keep playing. He never forgave himself. This is a phrase his daughter used, specifically and deliberately, when she was asked to summarize her father's relationship to Wendell's death, and she said she had chosen the phrase carefully because it was the most accurate one available, even though everyone who loved Walter had spent decades trying to talk him out of needing forgiveness for something that was not his fault. It did not work. Walter understood, intellectually, every argument available for his innocence. He had been 11 feet away in an active firefight. He could not have closed that distance in less time than it took for the shot to be fired. There was no decision he made and no decision he failed to make that altered the outcome. He understood all of this. He said so explicitly in the oral history. And then, in the same interview, 20 minutes later, he said, "I know all of that. I have known all of that for 50 years. It has never once made any difference to how I feel walking past his photograph in the morning." That is a specific cruelty of this particular form of grief, that the intellectual exoneration and the emotional verdict operate on entirely separate tracks, and the second one does not yield to the first no matter how long or how thoroughly the first one is established. Walter knew he was innocent. He felt guilty anyway. Both of these were permanently true for the rest of his life, and he eventually stopped expecting the first one to ever defeat the second. What he did instead, and this is, I think, the most remarkable part of Walter's story, was build a life around the guilt rather than waiting for the guilt to leave before he could build a life. He did not solve the grief. He did not get past it in the way that phrase usually implies. He simply decided, sometime in his 40s, that Wendell would not have wanted the 4 minutes on that island consume the other 70 years that Walter had been given, and so Walter set about, very deliberately and very consciously, living 2 lives in the only way he knew how to honor a brother he could not bring back. He tried to live well enough for both of them. He named his first son Wendell. He kept his brother's photograph on the mantle for 64 years, not hidden, not shrine-like, simply present, the way you would keep the photograph of anyone you loved. He told his children stories about their uncle. Funny stories, ordinary stories, the kind of stories that keep a person present as a person rather than only as a wound. He went fishing every July on the day that would have been their joint birthday, alone, at the same lake they had fished together as boys. And he never told anyone what he did or thought about on those days. And his family learned, over the years, simply to let him go. He died at 87, in his sleep, in the house he had lived in for 60 years. His daughter found, among his papers, 70 years of one-sided letters. Walter had written to Wendell every year on the anniversary of his death, a practice he never mentioned to a single living person. Page after page, an ongoing conversation with a 22-year-old who would never get older, telling him what had happened in the family that year, what the children were doing, what the country looked like now. The final letter, written 11 months before Walter died, ended with the line, "I think I did all right for half a person. I hope you'd say the same." That is a full account of the war twins, one who came home and one who didn't, and the one who survived, who spent 70 years writing letters to a brother he could not save, in a guilt he never escaped and a love he never stopped living inside of. The specific letters that Walter wrote to Wendell across 7 decades deserve more attention than a single quoted line can give them, because the daughter who discovered them after his death described the full collection as one of the most extraordinary documents she had ever encountered, and reading them changed her understanding not only of her father, but of what an entire unspoken life can look like when it is finally written down. There were 65 letters in total, one for every year from 1945 to 2009, with a gap in 1962 that the family could never explain, the only year in 6.5 decades that Walter apparently did not write or did not keep what he wrote. The letters were not long. Most ran 2 or 3 handwritten pages. They followed. His daughter noticed once she had read them all together, a loose and consistent structure that seemed to have established itself early, and then simply repeated year after year, as if Walter had found a form that worked and never saw reason to abandon it. He would begin with a date and a brief note about the weather or the season, then move into an account of what had happened in the family and the wider world that year, then close with something more personal, more difficult, a confession or a question, or simply a report on how he was managing. The early letters from the 1940s and 1950s read almost like a young man's diary addressed outward instead of inward. Accounts of meeting Dorothy, of the feed store, of the births of his children, written in the slightly stiff, dutiful tone of someone still learning how to do this strange new thing he had invented for himself, talking to a dead brother as though the brother might somehow still be receiving mail. By the 1960s and 1970s, the tone had relaxed into something closer to genuine conversation. Walter complaining about a difficult customer, describing a fight with Dorothy and how they had resolved it, asking Wendell's opinion on a decision about the children's schooling, as though he expected, in some non-literal but entirely sincere way, an answer might eventually occur to him. The later letters from the 1980s onward grew shorter and more direct, and it is in these that the daughter found material that affected her most. Walter, in his 60s and 70s, began using the letters less as updates and more as a place to say the things he could not say anywhere else, including, repeatedly, variations on the apology that had apparently never stopped needing to be made. "I'm sorry I was the one still standing," he wrote in 1985. "I have tried to make it worth something. I don't know if I have." In 1991, "Dorothy asked me last week if I still think about the island. I told her not every day anymore. That was a lie. I think about it every day. I just don't always tell her." The daughter said that what struck her most, reading the full sequence in order after his death, was not any single revelation, but the cumulative weight of watching her father have the same conversation in slightly different words for 65 consecutive years, without ever once receiving a reply, and apparently never expecting one, and apparently finding the writing necessary anyway. She said she came to understand the letters not as a sign of a man who was stuck or unable to heal, but as evidence of a discipline, a chosen, ongoing practice that Walter had constructed for himself because the alternative, simply letting the relationship with Wendell end entirely at the moment of death, was a thing he was never willing to do. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframed something that might otherwise read as simple unresolved trauma into something closer to a deliberate act of devotion. Walter was not failing to move on. Walter had decided, very early and very consciously by the evidence of how consistent the practice remained, that moving on was not the goal. The goal was to keep Wendell included in the family's life, in the year's events, in the small ongoing conversation of a brotherhood that physical death had interrupted, but that Walter refused to treat as finished. The letters were not a symptom. They were a relationship, maintained unilaterally, but maintained nonetheless. For 65 years, by a man who apparently could not imagine any version of his own life that did not still, in some essential way, include his brother as an active participant. His daughter has since donated the letters, with the family's permission, to a regional historical archive that collects materials related to Iowa's experience of the Second World War, where researchers studying grief and twin loss have begun to study them as one of the most complete documentary records of this particular form of bereavement ever recovered. Walter never knew, of course, that the letters would end up there. He wrote them every year to an audience of exactly one person who could never write back. And the fact that they have found a second audience now, decades later, is not something he could have anticipated or his daughter suspects would have entirely welcomed. He had been careful, after all, never to read a single one aloud to anyone in 65 years. But she believes, and she has said this publicly in interviews about the donation, that her father would ultimately have approved, because the letters are not only an account of his own grief. They are, page after page, a portrait of Wendell as a real and remembered person, full of small love details that Walter alone carried, and that would otherwise have vanished entirely from the historical record the moment Walter himself died. The letters do not just preserve Walter's guilt. They preserve Wendell's laugh, his habit of humming while he worked, the exact way he used to fold his hands when he was thinking. Walter, without ever intending the letters as anything other than private grief, ended up building the only complete biography his brother would ever have. There is one more piece of the story that needs telling before the full accounting can close, and it concerns the thing Wendell said in his final minute that Walter never repeated to anyone for the entire rest of his life. Walter mentioned the existence of this final statement in the 1994 oral history, and the interviewer, by every account a careful and respectful professional who understood the boundaries of grief, did not press him for the content. She asked only whether he thought he would ever share it, and Walter reportedly sat in silence for nearly a full minute before answering. He said, "It wasn't meant for anyone but me. I've thought about whether keeping it is selfish. I've decided it isn't. Some things are only supposed to pass between two people, and when one of them dies, the other one is allowed to keep the secret intact rather than spend it on an audience, even an audience that loved him too." This decision to protect the content of his brother's final words, even from his own children, even from the comprehensive letters he wrote every year for 65 years, even from the historians and researchers who would have valued the material immensely, is, I think, the single most revealing fact in Walter's entire story, because it demonstrates something that all the guilt and all the grief and all the 70 years of mourning sometimes obscure, that Walter's relationship with Wendell was never primarily about Walter's pain. It was about Wendell. Walter's guilt was a consequence of his loss, but his loyalty was a larger and more permanent thing. And the loyalty extended even protecting his brother's privacy in death the same way he would have protected it in life. His daughter, asked directly whether she resented not knowing what her uncle's final words had been, said she had thought about this for years and had ultimately arrived somewhere unexpected, gratitude rather than resentment. She said that her father's refusal to share those words was, in its own way, the clearest possible evidence of how completely he had loved his brother. Not abstractly, not as a wound or a cause, but specifically as an individual person whose wishes and whose dignity mattered more to Walter than the family's natural desire to know everything, to possess every part of the story, to leave nothing locked away. She said, "I think my father understood, better than almost anyone I have ever known, that loving someone means sometimes keeping their secrets even after they're gone, especially after they're gone, because the dead can't ask for privacy anymore, and somebody has to do it for them. My father did that for 65 years. He kept the one thing that was only ever Wendell's, and he let the rest of it, the grief, the guilt, the love, the whole enormous weight of it, be his own to spend however he needed to. I think that was the last gift he ever gave his brother. And I think it might be the most important thing in this entire story. Walter died, as the record now shows, having kept that promise completely. Whatever Wendell said in his last conscious minute on a Pacific island in 1944 died again, a second and final time, with Walter in 2009, and no documentary record, no letter, no interview transcript contains it. This is, in its way, a kind of mercy embedded inside an otherwise unrelievably difficult story. Proof that even amidst 70 years of guilt that never resolved and grief that never fully healed, Walter found at least one thing he could do perfectly and completely for his brother, without complication, without failure, without the haunting sense of having fallen short that defined nearly everything else he carried. He kept the secret. He kept it all the way to the end. In a life Walter believed, by his own repeated accounting, he had lived imperfectly in his brother's place. This was a one task he never once doubted he had done right. That is the full accounting of the war twins, Walter and Wendell, born 4 minutes apart, separated forever on a Pacific island, one of them frozen at 22 and perfect in memory, the other required to keep living, keep aging, keep failing and succeeding and failing again for 65 more years, writing letters to an address that could never receive them, fishing alone every July, and keeping, without a single lapse, the one secret his brother had trusted him to keep. He never forgave himself for surviving. He never once broke his word to the dead. The broader question this story raises, about how a culture grieves losses that don't fit its existing categories, extends well beyond the specific case of twins, and it is worth pausing on before closing, because Walter's experience was an extreme version of something much more common than most people realize. Every culture develops, over time, a working vocabulary for the losses it expects to encounter regularly. English has rich and well-developed language for widowhood, for orphanhood, for the loss of a parent or a child. It has almost no comparable vocabulary for the loss of a twin, because twin loss, statistically, has always been rare enough that the language never needed to develop the same depth. Walter was grieving inside a culture that simply did not have the words ready for him, and so he had to build his own words from scratch, the way he built the word amputation, the way he built 65 years of letters, because no existing ritual told him what else to do with a grief this specific and this large. This same gap between an unusual grief and the available cultural vocabulary for processing it recurs throughout this entire series. The nurse who could not speak about what she had witnessed for 40 years. The chaplain who carried thousands of unspeakable confessions in total isolation. The interpreter who lost his sense of his own voice. Each of these stories describes a person encountering a form of loss or weight that their culture had not anticipated and had not prepared language for, and each of them had to do what Walter did. Invent a private practice, alone, that served the function ritual usually serves, without any of ritual's social support. Walter's letters, in this light, were his liturgy. The annual fishing trip was his pilgrimage. The grave visited every year, without companions, was his shrine, and the gravestone's inscription, the better half, was his creed. However mistaken its theology may have been about which brother had actually been better. He built, alone and without instruction, an entire private religion of grief and devotion, sustained for 65 years, because the religion he'd been given did not have a sacrament for what had happened to him. This is, I think, the most useful thing a story can offer anyone watching who carries a grief that does not match the shape of the grief other people expect from them. The grief that is too unusual, too specific, too unlike the templates the culture provides comfort for. Walter's answer was not to wait for the right words to be handed to him. He built the words himself, slowly, imperfectly, over decades, refusing to let the absence of an existing ritual mean the absence of any ritual at all. He never resolved his guilt. He never stopped believing the wrong twin had survived. But he also never stopped showing up at the grave, at the lake, at the writing desk every year on the same date. And in the end, that showing up, sustained without fail for 65 years, became its own kind of answer to a question that had no answer otherwise. The letters are in an archive now. The fishing lake is still there. The grave still reads a better half. And somewhere in all of that, a man who believed for 70 years that he was only half of something managed, through sheer persistence, to build something whole out of the half that remained. Subscribe and share this story with someone who has ever carried a grief they didn't have the words for. Sometimes the words have to be built, one year at a time, by hand, by the person carrying the weight, because no one else can build them for you. Walter built his. They are in the world now. That is the full accounting of the war twins. One who came home, one who didn't, and the one who survived, who never forgave himself, and who never once stopped loving his brother enough to keep showing up anyway. Dorothy's perspective on all of this, Walter's wife of 61 years, who lived alongside this grief without ever fully being permitted inside it, deserves a final, careful word, because her position in the story is its own kind of quiet sacrifice that the narrative has not yet fully honored. She married a man at 26 who told her plainly, on their first real conversation, that part of him was buried in the Pacific and might never come home. She married him anyway, and she spent 61 years loving the whole of him, including the part she could never reach. She set 2 cups of coffee down some mornings too. She admitted once to her daughter, not from confusion, but from a kind of learned habit of accommodating an absence that had become, over the decades, almost a third presence in the house. She never read the letters while Walter was alive. She knew they existed. She found the first few by accident in the 1950s, tucked in a drawer, and she made the decision, consciously and immediately, never to read them and never to mention that she had seen them. She told her daughter, after Walter's death, that she had made this choice because she understood instinctively that the letters were the one room in her husband's life she was not invited into, and that a good marriage sometimes means knowing which doors to leave closed, not out of distance but out of respect. She outlived Walter by only 14 months. Her daughter said that in those final months, her mother spoke about Wendell more openly than she ever had in 60 years of marriage, not with bitterness about the part of her husband she had never fully possessed, but with something closer to tenderness toward a man she had never met and had nonetheless spent her entire adult life sharing her husband with. She said near the end, "I loved all of Walter, even the part that belonged to someone else. I think that's just what loving a twin surviving brother means. You sign up for 2 people, and you only ever get to meet one of them." She asked to be buried near Walter, and near Wendell Stone as well, the 3 graves now forming a small triangle in the Iowa cemetery that the family visits together each year. Not on anniversary, which remains Walter's Day alone even now, observed informally by family members who simply know not to schedule anything else. But at Christmas, when the whole family comes together and makes the short drive to stand for a few minutes at all 3 stones before going home for dinner, that triangle of stones is, in the end, the most complete image this story can offer. 2 brothers born 4 minutes apart, separated by a war, reunited finally in the ground, and a woman beside them who loved the survivor enough to make room, for 61 years, for the brother she would never get to know. Subscribe and share this story. The full accounting of any grief this large always includes more people than the one who carried the heaviest part of it, and Dorothy's quiet, decades-long patience deserves to be remembered as its own form of love, every bit as real and every bit as costly as Walter's letters. The town itself, the small Iowa county where Walter and Wendell grew up, enlisted, and where Walter eventually returned to live out the rest of his life, played its own quiet role in this story that deserves a final mention before closing. Small towns of this era had developed, almost universally, their own informal customs for handling exactly this kind of situation. A community that had known both twins since birth, that had attended the same school, the same church, the same county fair every August, now faced with the task of welcoming one of them home while collectively, silently, agreeing never to make Walter's homecoming a referendum on Wendell's absence. The town's response, as Walter's daughter later described it, was a masterclass in unspoken collective grace. No one asked Walter to retell the story unless he offered it first. No one referred to him, even accidentally, by his brother's name within his hearing, though several older residents admitted, decades later, to having to consciously catch themselves more than once. The Lions Club inducted him without ceremony or special mention. The church simply made room for him in the same pew his family had always occupied, the space where Wendell would have sat left, for the first several months, conspicuously and deliberately empty until Walter himself, one Sunday in late 1945, moved over and closed the gap himself, and the congregation understood, without being told, that this was a decision only Walter was allowed to make. This kind of communal tact, unrecorded and largely unrepeatable in any formal history, was itself a form of care that allowed Walter the room he needed to grieve at his own pace, in his own private vocabulary, without an entire county constantly reopening the wound through well-meaning but clumsy acknowledgement. The town did not pretend Wendell had not existed. They simply let Walter set the terms of how present his brother's absence would be allowed to be on any given day, and they followed his lead without requiring him to ask. This is worth remembering alongside everything else this episode has documented, because Walter's 70 years of private grief did not happen in a vacuum of communal indifference. It happened inside a community that, in its own limited and imperfect way, understood enough to give him space rather than scrutiny, and that quiet, collective patience is its own small piece of full accounting. Proof that even when a culture lacks a vocabulary for an unusual grief, ordinary decency can sometimes function as a substitute, imperfectly but genuinely, for the words that were never built. That is a complete story, as fully as it can be told, of the war twins, Walter and Wendell, from minutes apart in birth and 11 feet apart in death, one of them frozen forever at 22, and the other required to keep living for 65 more years, in the shadow and the love of a brother he could not save and would not stop writing to. He never forgave himself. He never stopped showing up anyway. Both of those things were true every single day for the rest of his long life. One final detail, drawn from a 1994 oral history, belongs here at the close of this account, because it captures something the rest of this episode has only been able to approach from the outside. Near the end of the recorded interview, after 30 hours spent across several sessions, the interviewer asked Walter a question she said she'd been saving until she felt she had earned the right to ask it. Did he think, after everything, that he would have traded his own surviving for Wendell's? Walter did not answer immediately. The recording, according to the archive's notes, contains nearly 90 seconds of silence before he speaks again, an unusually long pause even by the standards of an interview process built around difficult questions. When he finally answered, he said, "I used to think the answer was obviously yes, that I would have traded without a second thought, and for years I told people that, and I believed it when I said it. I don't think that's true anymore, and it took me 50 years to admit it to myself. I have a wife I love. I have children and grandchildren who would not exist if I had died on that island instead of him. Wendell would have wanted those people to exist. He would have wanted Dorothy to have a husband and our children to have a father, even if it meant it had to be me instead of him. So the honest answer now is no. I would not trade it, not because my life matters more than his did, but because the people who came after both of us matter more than the math of which twins should have lived." I think Wendell would agree with that. If he could, I have to believe he would. It's the only way any of this makes any sense at all. This is perhaps the closest Walter ever came to something like peace, not the resolution of his guilt, which he carried unbroken until his last year, but a kind of working accommodation with it, an answer that let him keep loving his brother, keep grieving him, keep believing Wendell had been the better man, while still finding a reason, finally after 50 years, to be glad for the specific life he had actually lived. He did not forgive himself. He found, instead, something adjacent to forgiveness that served almost as well, a reason good enough to keep going that did not require the guilt to disappear first. That is where this story ends, and where Walter himself seemed to leave it. Not resolved, not healed in any complete sense, but reconciled enough in his final years to say a true and complicated yes to the life he had been given on behalf of the brother who could no longer say yes or no to anything at all. The letters are in an archive. The grave reads the better half. The lake is still there every July. And somewhere in Iowa, in a small triangle of headstones, two brothers born 4 minutes apart are finally, after everything, together again. The interviewer who conducted that 1994 oral history later said, in her own notes archived alongside the recording, that Walter's case had changed how she approached every subsequent interview with a combat veteran. She wrote that she had gone into the project expecting stories of guilt to resolve, eventually, into something like acceptance, the way grief was generally described in the clinical literature available to her at the time. Walter taught her that some griefs do not resolve. They simply get carried year after year by people determined enough to keep carrying them without ever setting them down, and that this ongoing carrying was not a failure to heal, but was, in its own right, a complete and valid way of living a long and meaningful life. She said Walter was the most fully alive, unhealed person she had ever met, and that the contradiction in that description was a whole point. Healing was never the only way to be whole. That is the full accounting of the war twins. One came home. One didn't. The one who survived never forgave himself and never stopped loving his brother enough to keep showing up anyway. For 65 years, one letter at a time.